Following the release of Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, Monster Hunter World was the first game to kick off the 5th generation of Monster Hunter. This title was released exclusively on Xbox One and PS4, with a PC release to follow later that same year. It was clear this was the game that was diving headfirst with Capcom's mission in conquering the hearts of the Western world. With major success in Western regions, they followed on to making its expansion title, Monster Hunter World Iceborne, which once again was met with much praise and positive feedback overall. The expansion followed a similar release pattern to the base game, with the PC version being released way after the console's release. And then we would see the announcement and subsequent release of the timed exclusive Generation 5 game, Monster Hunter Rise, which released on the Nintendo Switch. This game would also be met with a lot of positive reception, however there was a considerable amount of backlash due to the base game content not fully being there at launch, with that content being pushed back into its initial title updates. The PC version would then go on to be announced and released a year later, which was quickly followed up with the Sunbreak expansion later that same year, with it being released on all platforms simultaneously. Overall, Generation 5 was a success, being able to show how Monster Hunter had innovated over time, and it would massively help expand the Monster Hunter audience, with Monster Hunter World being Capcom's best-selling game to this date. And with that, this video is going to discuss which one is better between the two Generation 5 games, Monster Hunter World or Monster Hunter Rise. So let's get into it. Story hasn't always been a driving force behind Monster Hunter titles, and arguably still isn't to this day. Many players play through these titles without having any real idea of what is actually happening in the story, instead focusing on the mastery of weapons and monsters. While it isn't at the forefront, Monster Hunter does have a few stories to offer, and in some cases, very good ones, and in other cases, some extremely poor ones that are probably best left forgotten. Monster Hunter World's story focuses heavily on nature and elder dragons, and it's also the first time we get to experience the new world. While we're not the first ones there, we are the first to make a massive impact, as you'd expect, being the main character. The Elder Crossing is one of the key plot points for the story, and this is a cycle of death, where elder dragons travel to the Elder Recess and die to supercharge the ecosystem with bioenergy, allowing new life to grow with their departure. While it used to occur every century, it weirdly starts to occur every decade, and throughout the game you slowly uncover the reasoning as to why this is happening. Monster Hunter Rise's story focuses on the Rampage. The player character is informed that they've been promoted to the title of Hunter by the Guild, and the village leader then goes on to inform everyone about the pending signs of the Rampage, a mysterious calamity that occurred 50 years prior to the game's time, where a large horde of monsters attack the village in a frenzied state, and it's the player's job to figure out what is causing the rampage and help defend the village. While both stories are relatively okay, I think I give the point to Monster Hunter World in this case, as I think the new world gives the story a strong edge, as a lot of it is a mystery given it's the first game we experience hunting in that region of the Monster Hunter world, no pun intended. I also enjoy the focus on elder dragons and their life cycle, which I personally find extremely intriguing and hope to see a lot more of in the future of Monster Hunter games and expansions. Rise's story isn't necessarily bad, but I think the focus being on the defense of the village is something we've seen before, and not as interesting as learning about the series' staple and powerhouses that are the Elder Dragons. Monster Hunter World's base game village is called Astera. This village is built primarily out of wood, and some has been taken from the very ships that brought the Research Commission into the new world. It rests below a waterfall that is between the Ancient Forest and Wildspire Waste, two maps that can be accessed when out on quests. This could be viewed as more of a base opposed to the traditional villages that we are used to seeing in the Monster Hunter series, built to support hunters and researchers as they explore the new world and its ecology. Monster Hunter Rise's main area is called Kamura Village. This is the main hub of Rise's base game, and unlike all the other Monster Hunter games in the series, it allows players to participate in multiplayer while still in the village. The village has been wiped out and rebuilt multiple times prior to the present day in the game's story due to the rampage, so the villagers of the village are training day in and day out to prevent this outcome from ever happening again. Due to this, a sturdy stronghold was built in order to better prepare for the next invasion, which proves extremely useful in the game's story. For this section, I'm going to put this as a draw, as I think Astera does an excellent job in capturing how messy and all over the place the base's setup has been, given they've moved to a completely new region and tried to make use of resources in every way they possibly can to aid their mission. The location also makes a lot of sense, and aesthetically I think it looks really good. However, I think that's a bit of an unfair point to give, as that does kind of fall under the graphics category, as I think graphics go a long way in putting across the intention of a design. But of course, we will go into graphics next. The main drawback of Astera being the actual practical distance between vendors. Many players do tend to get annoyed with how far they are having to travel between the significant vendors of each Monster Hunter game, which is understandable given how compact the older villages were in comparison, and that includes the newer Rise village. Camera Village, however, is also very fitting of the game's theme, and overall is very compact, as I just mentioned, for very intuitive navigation between vendors. But in general, for the theme that the village is going for, I do prefer Astera. That's why even though Rise has less drawbacks, Astera does tie it out in this category. Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise stand as the only two games currently in the mainline series with maps that are seamless, opposed to the classic segmented style of map design. Monster Hunter World offered 5 main locations at launch, and these maps were the Ancient Forest, Wildspire Waste, Coral Highlands, Rotten Vale, and Elder Recess, all of which have a vast area to explore and hunt monsters in. Monster Hunter Rise also offered 5 locations, those being the Shrine Ruins, Flooded Forest, Frost Islands, Sandy Plains, and Lava Caverns. In general, both games offer a solid selection of locations for hunts to take place, but I think World did the better job in creating strong immersion for the player with how the world was filled and detailed. But this falls onto the debate of it being an unfair comparison due to, of course, the primary consoles that the games were developed for respectively. Monster Hunter Rise did do an excellent job with the hardware it was built for, with a solid area of land to explore and overall solid attempt at giving the locations life and detail. But I think World did do a much better job at involving the story and being more blatant with the story behind the locations that the hunter travels to, so the point here is going to go to Monster Hunter World. The combat component of this matchup is relatively straightforward. They do have very similar combat mechanics and combos as you'd expect, with Rise coming out after World, and of course it came out a decent amount of time afterwards, so it did take a lot of the new combos from World and then expand upon them in its own game. Of course, Rise has some additional moves for every weapon type, and also the Wirebug related actions are also added on to those movesets for every single weapon once again. There are some things that I do think World still did better though, like the Charge Blade for example. I think overall it plays much better in Monster Hunter World, but for the most part I'd say Rise has the more engaging combat, with the additional mechanics available for the player to use. You could argue that the combat of Rise and the new mechanics introduced have taken away from the difficulty in Monster Hunter, so you could see the upgrade in movesets as a negative, but I think with the right monster tuning in any situation where this is the case, it can be made more punishing once again. So with that potential issue having such an easy remedy, the point here goes naturally to Monster Hunter Rise, as of course it's pretty much a better expansion of the combat system from World in most areas. Right, so next we have the graphics. I think this category is relatively self-explanatory and a tiny bit unfair. While the graphics of Monster Hunter Rise are very impressive for the original platform the game was developed for, Monster Hunter World, I think, went above and beyond in recreating the Monster Hunter series in a more realistic way, and the graphics were definitely one of the driving forces that Capcom used in order to bring in that Western audience to the franchise, and I think it definitely did its job. So without going too much into this, point here goes to Monster Hunter World. In terms of art style, Monster Hunter World was quite restricted in terms of what they could do with various armor and weapons in the game due to the realistic graphics the game was striving to achieve. Anything too over the top would be more riskier in terms of looking out of place, and I think many players were not too big of a fan of this, especially considering the crazy designs we had prior to this game in the franchise. You could argue that this game did well in terms of its art style, given the theme it was going for, but I will be judging this on what I prefer, regardless of its intention. Monster Hunter Rise, on the other hand, had a more classic art style, with it being closer to the original games except in HD. They definitely went for a more authentic Japanese style across the board as well, and I think it really captured that portable third feeling that many of us missed due to the game never coming over to the West in any official form. I think Rise definitely did an amazing job with its art style, so point here goes to Monster Hunter Rise. The base game's monsters comparison is a little bit weird here, as Rise did have a bit of issues around its launch that resulted in its base game being completed a couple of title updates later. For the sake of this comparison, I will compare monsters from Monster Hunter World's base game at launch and Monster Hunter Rise's state after All Mother Nawar was released, as I believe that was the intended base game launch. Monster Hunter World had a total of 31 monsters, including new and old, while Rise on the other hand had 40 monsters, but that's including the title update monsters that should have been in the base game. But even without those monsters, Rise still sits at 34, which is still pretty solid, and while the monsters in both games are pretty strong in terms of their lineup, and there are a bunch of variations in both, with World having tempered monsters and Rise having apex monsters, I think overall, even with the bigger monster count, World has a stronger lineup, especially considering the newer monsters that were introduced, as I am a big fan of the new monsters that World introduced opposed to what Rise introduced. And if we were looking at the game's actual launch, so comparing Monster Hunter World's launch to Monster Hunter Rise's launch, I think World easily wins this point. Next up, we have the pet category. I think this area is pretty straightforward. Like, while you can have a Palico in Monster Hunter World, Rise allows you to have 2 Palicos or Palamutes, which is the new dog companion. And there's not much competition here, as Rise pretty much has everything and more compared to World, so Rise is pretty much automatically awarded this point. This is arguably one of the biggest debates between the two games, the Clutch Claw versus the Wire Bug. Monster Hunter World introduced us to the Clutch Claw, which allowed players to be more versatile in their environmental interactions, as well as having the ability to grapple onto the monster. While it was well received for the most part, Iceborne is where it started to get some backlash, where it made it mandatory in slaying monsters quickly, as it would be required to weaken a monster's body part for additional critical damage to be dealt. Monster Hunter Rise took a similar path in introducing us to a grapple-like mechanic, except this came in the form of a much more free Wire Bug. This pretty much lets the hunter become Spider-Man temporarily by zipping to wherever they aim. However, this would have a cooldown, with the player only having access to 2 or 3 Wire Bugs at one given time. This opened up a massive bag of maneuverability, with the player having more vertical freedom than ever before, with weapons also getting their respective Silkbind attacks that utilise the Wire Bug in a variety of ways. The main drawback to this was the Wire Bug variation of Wyvern riding, which completely replaced the mechanic. Many players felt forced to carry this out if they dealt enough damage using a switch skill, and this would later be remedied in the Sunbreak expansion, which definitely was a nice fix. While the Clutch Claw was pretty sweet at the time, and was overall a solid addition to the franchise, and I would love to see it return, I think the point here will go to the Wire Bug, as it was much more of a game changer and allowed a level of versatility we wish we had traversing the tree system in the Ancient Forest. So point here, as I said, goes to Monster Hunter Rise. This is going to be an extremely controversial one, as I'm sure everyone has their preferences when it comes to farming, and they are going to differ greatly. So the concept is relatively similar. Monster Hunter World had us farming various quests for decorations, the jewels that we can place into our armor sets to boost the skills. In many other games, these decorations were able to be crafted with monster materials, giving the player less RNG and more control over a large factor of their armor, and they would be able to choose when and how they obtain the decorations. Instead, players would be able to craft charms, which are similar to decorations, except charms can be upgraded, just like any other armor piece, although you cannot slot multiple charms into your armor like you can slot multiple decorations in. Monster Hunter Rise, on the other hand, brought back craftable decorations and made talismans the pieces that we have to farm. Decorations are the same in terms of how they are used in Monster Hunter World as they are in Monster Hunter Rise, as you'd expect, but talismans are like charms except they cannot be upgraded in the same way. Instead, if you are able to get a talisman to drop with decoration slots, you can add additional skills similar to how you would slot decorations into your other armor pieces. These talismans can be obtained by handing in a bunch of monster materials into the melder, and then depending on the type of melding, it generates a random assortment of talismans with varying skills and decoration slots, and in some cases, no decoration slots. For the farming section, I will be giving the point to Monster Hunter Rise, simply due to the fact that talismans, you only require one to round out an armor set or complete your build, whereas with decorations you might need 15 or like 5 attack jewels or something of the sort, where it's much more difficult in terms of RNG to have that consistent luck to get the same thing 5 times opposed to getting it once. So simply just due to that, even though I enjoy decoration farming in World and got bored of talisman farming relatively quickly in Rise, the system in general is much better in Monster Hunter Rise for the sake of your sanity and just overall RNG. So as I said, point goes to Monster Hunter Rise. The endgame is an important aspect of Monster Hunter. This is the area of the games that most players will remember as what made the game good or bad. Monster Hunter World had the player utilise investigations in the endgame in order to find stronger and stronger monsters. There were multiple tiers as they progressed, with a specific range of monsters within each tier. The powered up monsters were named Tempered. These tempered monsters would be much more aggressive and deadlier than their normal counterparts, and these quests would reward the player with various decorations, generally along with the materials that allowed for weapon augmentation. Monster Hunter Rise, on the other hand, had rampages, and the apex monsters you face at the end were the focus, with decoration farming being replaced with talismans as we discussed in the previous section. This category was hard to give one side a definitive point, as I think both games didn't do amazingly in terms of giving the player an endgame that was varied and fun. After players had experienced World's endgame properly, it ended up consisting of a few tempered Elder Dragons that the player could face, but most players would end up facing off against one specific Elder, Valhazak, due to the easier difficulty in comparison to the other Elders. Monster Hunter Rise, on the other hand, had a couple of apex monsters that the player could face at the end of a given rampage, but this was practically the same as facing a tempered monster after fighting a few other monsters in the form of a horde defense. The point here is going to go to Monster Hunter World, simply due to the fact that I just prefer the overall endgame far more in World opposed to Rise. I prefer the tempered monsters over Apex. I feel like there was a lot of missed opportunities with the Apex monsters, considering they were pretty much the deviants. They could have had some armor sets in there, but they chose not to. Instead, they just had the ramp up system with the rampage tickets, and I preferred the augmentation system over that ramp up system. Just in general, I found it far more engaging in World opposed to what they did in Rise. So as I said, point goes to Monster Hunter World. So the original plan was to compare the expansions as well, but since Rise's life cycle is still underway with the Sunbreak title updates, I think this is worthy of a video in itself for a later date, like when the next Monster Hunter game releases and we know that Rise is finally done with its content drops. Of course, it would be unfair to compare Iceborne with all its additions to a Sunbreak that isn't fully done with all its content drops post-launch, so with that said, let's leave this category as it is and jump onto the verdict. So we have finally reached the verdict of this video. The games are currently equal in terms of points that I've awarded so far. I think both games did really well as base games, although I think World definitely did better for its launch given the amount of content that had to be added in the first two title updates for Monster Hunter Rise in order to finish off the game for its intended base game release. If I involved the expansions, I would have given the overall win to Monster Hunter World, but of course, just as I had started writing that, it's clearly unfair to compare that aspect of the two games as Rise hasn't fully finished its life cycle. I've definitely had a lot more enjoyment in playing Monster Hunter World. I think the graphics was one of the main driving forces, as it was a breath of fresh air to see Monster Hunter in a way that was less cartoony in a sense. That's probably not the best way to describe it, but you would understand what I mean if you have played the other games, or at least seen the other games, and then seen how World looks. there is a very big contrast between the art styles and the graphics intentions between the two titles, and of course Monster Hunter World was designed for the more powerful consoles and of course the PC, whereas Rise was released on the Switch, and the previous games were also, many of them were released on the portable consoles. So it does make sense as to why the graphics were such a big jump to Monster Hunter World. But the graphics from World definitely did captivate me in a way that not many other games have done in recent years. So while it is a very close tie, Monster Hunter World does slightly edge out Rise, exclusively based on how it graphically captured and immersed me in a way that not many other games have done in recent years. As I said previously in the video, I will be doing an expansion comparison when the next Monster Hunter game releases, so we know that Rise is fully done with its title drops. But of course guys, this is just my take on the debate as to which game is better between Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise. So let me know down below what game you guys prefer and where you would award points for the aspects discussed in this video, and I look forward to reading all of your comments. As always, a like would be extremely appreciated if you could just drop one on this video. It does help out the channel a ton, and as I said, I am extremely grateful for when you guys do hit that like button and comment and subscribe and just overall engage with the video. Subscribe for a lot more Monster Hunter content. Of course, there is a lot more on the way, and don't forget to join our Discord, link is at the top of the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.